welcome back. So far we've seen how homeopathy has no physical means of working, and although no qualifications are necessary to become a homeoquack, we've compared a BSc in homeopathy to one in medicine. We've also seen how homeopaths have misrepresented the Swiss government's views by using views that weren't the Swiss government's. Evidence for homeopathy is a bugbear. Homeopaths say there's loads, everyone else says they're full of crap. In this video we'll see how much evidence the Society of Homeopaths was able to bring to bear when a complaint was made to the Advertising Standards Authority. 3 issues were covered. First was a tweet by the Society that said, "Antidepressant prescriptions up by 43%. For more holistic healthcare which doesn't rely on drugs, try homeopathy," with a link to the Society's webpage. This breached the code stating that marketers must not discourage essential medical treatment for conditions where medical supervision must be sought. The ASA considered that the tweet targeted people with depression, particularly those prescribed antidepressants. It considered that the tweet encouraged those consumers to consider homeopathic treatment for their depression, and that homeopathy is not subject to statutory regulation like medicine. It also considered that the Society could not demonstrate that treatment would be conducted by a suitably qualified professional. As we know, it's a crapshoot as to whether a homeopath has any qualifications at all, and even if they do, it's questionable how much that qualification is actually worth. Professional charlatanry seems to be an oxymoron in any case. The ASA upheld the complaint. The second and third issues concerned text on the Society's website. The ruling on the second issue was much along the lines of the first. The third issue concerned a claim on the website that stated, "There is sufficient research evidence to support the use of homeopathic treatment for the following medical conditions," which it then listed. After the complaint was made, the Society amended the wording to say, "To date, conditions for which the majority of clinical trial findings have been positive include." However, the ASA did not consider that the new wording would have changed the way in which consumers interpreted the claims, and that consumers would expect the advertisers to hold robust scientific evidence to support the use of homeopathy for the listed conditions. Evidence regarding bronchitis, osteoarthritis and vertigo were not considered by the ASA. These are conditions for which medical attention must be sought, and in the case of homeopathy, it could not be guaranteed that treatment would be conducted under suitably qualified supervision. Also, the code prohibits even referring to bronchitis, osteoarthritis and vertigo, regardless of whether claims can be substantiated. For the other listed conditions, the Society of Homeopaths provided the ASA with research papers to support its claims. They should have their finger on the pulse of homeopathic research, so let's see how well they did. For allergies and upper respiratory tract infections, they provided 3 papers. The first didn't concentrate on efficacy. The second showed only non-significant effects or no effectiveness over placebo. The third paper's own authors noted general weaknesses in the evidence. These were due to lack of independent confirmation of reported trials and the presence of conflicting results. The ASA concluded that the Society's claim was misleading and had not been substantiated. It provided 1 paper in support of homeopathic treatment of sprained ankles. The study was in German and concerned 73 individuals. The data could not be fully evaluated beyond its English summary. It's a shame the ASA didn't use a translator. However, 73 individuals is a small number of participants. The ASA concluded it was insufficient evidence of efficacy of homeopathy for treating sprained ankles, and that the Society's claims of sufficient research evidence was misleading. If we consider their amended wording, the claim that the majority of clinical findings have been positive for this condition is also misleading. The Society provided 1 study to substantiate the claim that there was sufficient research evidence with regard to childhood diarrhea. It looks to be this one by Jennifer Jacobs et al. Of 2003, in which Jacobs analysed 3 of her earlier papers. A 1993 paper based on a pilot study in Nicaragua, a 1994 paper in which she tested homeopathy on children with acute diarrhea in Nicaragua, and a 2000 paper in which she tested homeopathy on children with acute diarrhea in Nepal. Interestingly, in her 2003 analysis, she indicates that the work for this paper was actually undertaken in 1994, so it seems it took 6 years before the paper was published, in the Journal for Alternative and Complementary Medicine. The 2000 paper concluded that homeopathy offered an 18.4% better probability than placebo of being diarrhea-free by day 5. Or, to put it another way, despite the theatre of individualising treatments, you stand less than a 1 in 5 chance of it being better than placebo after 5 days of diarrhea misery. Unsurprisingly, Jacob's analysis of her own work confirmed her early conclusions that homeopathy reduces the duration and severity of childhood diarrhea. In considering the paper, the ASA noted that the active arm of the study did not use identical treatments because it used individualised ones. The study was insufficient to demonstrate the efficacy of homeopathy in treating childhood diarrhea. The ASA concluded that the Society's claim was misleading and had not been substantiated. But wait, we're not done yet. In 2006, Jacobs published another paper having tested homeopathy on children with acute diarrhea in Honduras. In that paper, she found that the homeopathic combination treatment tested in this study did not significantly reduce the duration or severity of acute diarrhea in Honduran children. Undeterred, however, Jacobs reveals a possible bias and finishes by saying that further study is needed to develop affordable and effective methods of using homeopathy to reduce the global burden of childhood diarrhea. Why would you do that when it doesn't work? Having only submitted one paper, it's obvious that the Society of Homeopaths didn't include this later paper in its submission to the ASA. A study by the same author showing no significant effect would somewhat lessen their claim of sufficient research evidence supporting homeopathy, though. I'm sure omitting it was just an honest mistake, though. So let's add it to the scoreboard. One study from 2011 was provided for chronic fatigue, being a systematic review of 25 eligible RCTs examining homeopathic treatments in psychiatry. Speaking generally of psychiatry, the authors concluded that the results did not preclude the possibility of some benefit of homeopathic treatment. They stated there was some evidence for the efficacy of homeopathy in chronic fatigue syndrome. However, the ASA considered that the evidence was insufficient to support efficacy claims. The study also did not consider identical treatments. The claim of sufficient research evidence was deemed to be misleading. Of the 25 studies considered by the paper, effect size could only be calculated for 16, and it isn't clear from the abstract how many were for CFS. It seems though that there have only been 2. One was by R. Audrey from 1996, called Homeopathy May Help ME, where the title alone doesn't exactly suggest a conclusive finding. Audrey's trial involved just 64 participants. This is insufficient to demonstrate efficacy, although Whiting notes in 2001 that Audrey did not statistically analyse the results anyway. It is regarded as a poor quality trial. The other paper was this one by Weatherly-Jones et al. In 2004. It also happens to be the only specific trial of homeopathy on CFS that appears in PubMed, so this seems to be as good as the research has got. It concluded that there is weak but equivocal, i.e. dubious, evidence that the effects of homeopathic medicine are superior to placebo. Results also suggest that there may be non-specific benefits from the homeopathic consultation. Further studies are needed to determine whether these differences hold in larger samples. So weak and questionable evidence, and maybe some benefit of having a chat with a homeopath. Hardly compelling, and with only 92 patients, nowhere good enough to demonstrate efficacy or claim sufficient research evidence. We can be sure that the ASA would have taken the same view, particularly as the paper's own authors state that the evidence is weak and that further studies would be needed. These papers were the 2 available homeopathy papers considered by Al-Raq et al. In their 2011 paper. They evaluated 26 RCTs of different complementary and alternative medicines specifically dealing with CFS. They found that there was limited evidence of effectiveness for any of the CAM treatments they evaluated, but caveat heavily that they cannot draw firm conclusions. The conclusion for homeopathy is clearer than the other CAM treatments though, finding that, compared with placebo, homeopathy also had insufficient evidence of symptom improvement in CFS. There's also this 2011 review by Reed et al., which looked at 46 papers. The only homeopathy study used for CFS was the Westerly-Jones paper, the most significant one that exists. What did Reed et al. Make of it? Simple. homeopathy has not been studied in enough detail for us to draw conclusions on its efficacy. Their clinical guidance, therefore, was that there is insufficient evidence to recommend homeopathy as a treatment in chronic fatigue syndrome. Isn't it odd that the Society of Homeopaths felt that there was sufficient research evidence with regard to CFS? Of the 3 reviews covering homeopathy and CFS, isn't it also odd that the Society of Homeopaths chose the one that suggested efficacy, rather than the 2 that objectively concluded that there is insufficient evidence to recommend homeopathy? I'm sure it was just an honest mistake. Again, let's help them out and include Audrey's paper, the Weatherly-Jones one, Alrach's analysis, and Reed's analysis. As an aside, there's also this study dealing with something less difficult to treat than CFS, mental fatigue. It tested off-the-shelf homeopathic remedy Carlifos 6X on 86 volunteers and found it to be ineffective. Quelle surprise! One study was provided for ear infections, an analysis of 24 studies. Those with the highest patient numbers, being the ones most likely to show a statistically significant effect, showed only non-significant effects or no effectiveness over placebo. The Society's claim was therefore misleading and had not been substantiated. 2 studies were provided for fibromyalgia. The first was also provided in respect of chronic fatigue. The authors stated that whilst there was some evidence of efficacy with fibromyalgia, the studies were insufficiently rigorous and insufficiently plentiful to provide a definitive answer. When a paper's own authors state the results are insufficient, holding the paper up as sufficient research evidence isn't exactly viable. The ASA also considered that the study examined effectiveness rather than efficacy and again used different treatments. The second study considered 4 other studies. The ASA notes that none were without serious flaws and independent replications were missing. Given that choice of phrasing, it was probably this systematic review by Rachel Perry et al. From 2010 in Clinical Rheumatology. As well as noting the serious flaws in the 4 eligible RCTs, they also concluded that the effectiveness of homeopathy as a symptomatic treatment for FM remains unproven. Odd that the Society of Homeopaths would think that constitutes sufficient research evidence. The ASA found that the Society's claim was misleading and had not been substantiated. 3 studies were provided for hay fever. The authors of one noted shortcomings that the treatments varied in dilution, and that hay fever study results generally contain high placebo responses. Again, it was considered to be dealing with effectiveness rather than efficacy. The second paper only considered a sample size of 51. Despite reasonable objective findings, the subjective results reported more patients with aggravations, hardly a resounding success. The third paper was the one previously provided for allergies and upper respiratory tract infections, the one where its own authors acknowledged weaknesses in the evidence. None of the studies demonstrated efficacy of homeopathy in treating hay fever, and the Society's claims were therefore misleading. One paper was supplied to substantiate the claim with regard to treatment of influenza. It was a study of duck macerating remedy oscillococcinum, and considered 7 other papers. 3 flu prevention trials were included, with a total of 2,265 patients, and 4 treatment trials with 1,194 patients. It found that there was no evidence that homeopathic treatment can prevent influenza-like syndrome. The paper's own authors concluded that the data was not strong enough to support a recommendation for use of oscillococcinum for first-line treatment of flu. The Society's claim concerning influenza was therefore misleading. Again, the Society missed the paper. This 2012 paper by different authors considered 6 papers. The author's conclusion was that there is insufficient good evidence to enable robust conclusions to be made about oscillococcinum in the prevention or treatment of influenza and influenza-like illness. Our findings do not rule out the possibility of a useful effect, but given the low quality of the eligible studies, the evidence is not compelling. Oh well, this is more recent research, so we should probably add this to the scoreboard as well. One study was provided in respect of homeopathic treatment of premenstrual syndrome. Only 20 patients were used. The homeopathic treatments varied, but were not distinguished from each other. As a clearly labelled pilot study, it was insufficient to substantiate a claim of efficacy. The claim of sufficient research evidence to support the use of homeopathy for PMS was therefore misleading. In the world of real medicine, of course, holding up a pilot study testing remedies on 20 people and claiming sufficient research evidence would rightly have you laughed out of the building. It's amazing how low homeopaths set the bar of evidence or paper quality when they think it supports them. If 20 participants is compelling enough, 61 should be more so. So here's a small 2011 study which provides a compelling alternative to wasting money on a homeoquack if you have PMS. Regular moderate intensity exercise can have benefits with no sugar pills required. Moving on, one study was provided in respect of rheumatic diseases. The paper's own authors stated the results were mixed with regard to efficacy, and that there were too few studies to make definitive conclusions about the efficacy of any one type of homeopathic treatment on any one condition. The Society's claim of sufficient research evidence was therefore misleading and had not been substantiated. This paper by Jacobs et al. Could have been submitted to the ASA. It looks at a range of alternative treatments in rheumatic diseases. It found no convincing proof that they are more effective than control or placebo treatment, and closes by saying, if a particular treatment proves to be no more effective than placebo treatment, its use should be discouraged. There's this paper dealing specifically with homeopathy for rheumatoid arthritis by Fisher and Scott of the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital. Despite the obvious scope for bias, have a guess at their conclusion. We found no evidence that active homeopathy improves the symptoms of RA over 3 months. The Society could have included this in their submission. Okay, so the conclusion doesn't actually support their claim, but oh yeah, right. They could have included this one, which compared homeopathy to placebo and found no difference. Oh, right, this doesn't support the claim of sufficient research evidence either. Okay, what's next? 4 studies were provided for sinusitis. The first used a commercial product with concentrations at the upper limits of what is considered homeopathic. Although the paper concluded that the specific product used was effective, the claims could not be extrapolated to draw general conclusions about homeopathic remedies on sinusitis in general. The second paper's evidence supported the claim of efficacy for the specific product tested, namely Synfrontal, which is popular in Germany. It has 3 active ingredients listed, 1 diluted to 1 in a million, 1 to 1 in 10,000, and 1 to only 1 in 1,000. Even the most dilute ingredient is 10 to the 54 times more concentrated than the C30 preparations advocated by founding homeoquack Samuel Hahnemann. With Synfrontal, it is entirely possible that patients actually received some of the original ingredients. This study was rightly deemed not to be representative of homeopathic preparations generally, and so could not be used to draw wider conclusions about homeopathy. After all, just because ibuprofen relieves headaches, you can't go claiming that every other headache remedy is also efficacious by default. The third study was in German, so only the English summary could be considered. 2 products were compared to placebo. For the first, a higher number of patients rated the placebo as very good. The second product showed no difference from placebo. The results were confused and insufficient to demonstrate efficacy. The fourth study was also in German and considered 3 homeopathic preparations on 152 patients. There was no significant difference between any of them and placebo, and the tested remedies were at D3 and D4 dilutions, being 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000. Even with the high likelihood of the patient receiving some of the ingredients, they did nothing. Even if they had, D3 and D4 dilutions aren't representative of the tenets of homeopathy. Considering these 4 studies, there was no evidence of efficacy, and the Society's claim of sufficient research evidence was therefore misleading. So, the results are in, and it's a failure across the board. None of the listed conditions had sufficient evidence to support the use of homeopathic treatments. The Society of Homeopaths no longer mentions them on its website. We've seen then how homeopaths are prepared to claim sufficient research evidence for specific illnesses even when the authors of papers state that they are insufficient. We've seen papers using ludicrously small numbers of patients held up as sufficient research evidence, even though this standard would be laughable in any other field. We've seen papers where patients may have actually received some active ingredients, and so aren't representative of homeopathy. And we've even seen papers that show no difference from placebo being used to claim sufficient evidence for homeopathic treatments. I'm sure these are all just honest mistakes though. In the next part, however, we'll look at a paper that's held as proof of homeopathy that doesn't even mention homeopathy. What could possibly go wrong? See you then.